Welcome back to our podcast. And today we have Pat. Welcome to the show, Pat.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing well. You know, as we look out over the landscape, we're seeing some really interesting ideas out there in terms of where should capitalism go. Capitalism has been a successful model for centuries and has produced quite a standard of living. And we've seen that model change with technology. We've seen that model change as it adapts to different environments and different conditions. And I'm wondering whether we're in the era of another change as we get more technology in place, more data, more people involved in the economy, more people connected across the world. And there's so many different aspects of capitalism. A lot of it, of course, is around the core idea of intellectual property and individuals owning intellectual property and real property as well, and being able to exploit that, given, of course, the regulations and the norms and standards of the society and the economy at the time. But I'm wondering where we can go with capitalism, whether there's like a 2.0 out there or whether there's different flavors or focuses that we should focus on. Let's narrow down this conversation into the creative industry and some of the intellectual property issues around there. What are you seeing with people in the creative industry and how that conversation is going perhaps into the next version or 2.0 or 2.0.1 of capitalism, the micro side of things?
Well, it exists and it doesn't exist. So traditionally, the media markets are no different than any other market that's been subject to globalization, decentralization, and certainly less regulation because national governments have less and less power to implore multinational corporations to do anything. So what I think we've seen in capitalism since industrialization has been this concentration of capital and concentration of commercial power in the hands of fewer and fewer organizations, leading up until the 21st century when we've got a new breed of capitalistic company, and that would be digital platforms dominating global economies. And, we just have to look to the case of Facebook to understand how well regulations work with these companies. They're really basically unregulated. And I don't mean unregulated in terms of rules and, monitoring and so on. Regulation is really a biological term which refers to populations. And so when populations are unregulated, you can have negative consequences. So my view is that we're in an era where capital is ultra concentrated, and decision-making and power is also ultra concentrated. And capitalism has always been at odds with nationalism and with regulations, rules and regulations and oversight. But I think today we're in a situation where that's reached its pinnacle and hopefully its zenith. So having said that, in the creative industries, typically the currency, currency is currency, money changes hands in their transactions up and down the line in the value chain, but there's never been a point where it's been recognized that the real currency is intellectual property. So what we're seeing in these markets right now, particularly with companies like Netflix and Amazon and soon to be Disney in the streaming markets, is that the intellectual property really is the gold. That's where the long tail value monetarily is with this product. So you can't run a subscription service unless you have the rights, or unless you own the rights or have the right to use the content that you're charging for with your subscription fees, and that is currently the model. And then on the other side of the content spectrum, we've got entities like YouTube, who, by the way, is a massive platform owned by Google. So, here we're talking about Netflix, we're talking about Amazon, we're talking about Google, we're talking Facebook if they enter the content market. And there's no reason to believe that they won't. So these huge, massive platforms that are, publicly traded companies are dominating the landscape. So my view is that the individual creator has lost their place within the value chain, and in fact can only operate as a quote-unquote capitalist by being a service provider and by giving up their intellectual property rights and basically becoming a serf. So my view is that if we take a look at some other structures in history in terms of commercial activity by human beings, we could look to things like serfdom as an example. So are these people digital serfs? Do they have any opportunity? Do they have any power? I think not. So these days, basically, content creators are low-paid workers within the spectrum of the content value chain globally. I don't think that's my feedback. So I decided that I would like to reconceive this within a bunch of different perspectives, one being a biological perspective. So I follow a writer, David Sloan Wilson, who wrote a wonderful book called This View of Life, which is really could be the Bible for the evolution of the human species in the grand scheme of things. So highly recommend the book. And then we take a look at concepts like guilds from the Middle Ages, where craftsmen were able to belong to micro societies that had a great deal of influence within their markets. If you needed carpentry work done, you went to the Carpenters Guild. You didn't just look for the cheapest guy with a chisel. You actually looked for an entity that was able to give you great value, but at the same time, they were able to take care of themselves. So we've kind of lost our way in that way in our view. So I think the root is who owns the IP. So if you're creating micro pieces of content, you can own those pieces of content, and you should be able to get them to market and derive the value from those pieces of intellectual property. However, that's hard to do within the work context. So the way I and my company look at things is we look at it in terms of what is the intellectual property value and what is the long tail value of that, and how can we get it to audience so that we can extract that value over the long term. And then at the end of the day, the content creator owns the chattel, and the chattel is the content. So we took that one step further and we said, well, what about fractional ownership of content? If a group of people work on a piece of content, can it be fractionally owned, and can that ownership be then applied to any revenue streams that come in to divide the revenue pro rata, leaving the ownership within the hands of the individual creators who participate in the larger project? So that's exactly what we do. And we developed a platform and a community that does these things, and it's very popular. So the concept that, as I call it, is looking at social structures, and egalitarianism is something that I think is important. And that keeps us away from the dreaded discussion about capitalism versus socialism, because we're talking about neither, really. We're talking about egalitarianism, the ability to do the work that you want to do alone or within a group, retain the IP solely or fractionally, access global markets, and derive the long tail financial benefit from your intellectual property within the confines of that market. So that's really kind of what I'm up to.
Pat, when I was listening to what you're saying, there's sort of two issues in my mind that come up that maybe you can address a little further. One, I think you alluded to, but I'd like some clarification on it. That is in that if somebody is creating intellectual property or content in a paid manner, maybe they're on salary, typically that means that that intellectual property is owned by the person who paid for that other individual's time or thoughts. And I don't know how we can change that or address that, or were you specifically focusing on individuals who create things under their own time and effort, and they're not being paid by others? And the other issue Okay, the other issue that comes to mind is that if we're going to take intellectual property and divide it up amongst all those that contributed, maybe in a group or team environment, I can see real issues with trying to define who created what. Particularly in a team environment, it's maybe easier when each person does something separate. For example, one person does, let's say on a video, the visual aspect, another person does the audio aspect. That's, maybe easy to figure out who does what. But another aspect of that is, suppose the sum of the parts is greater than each individual part. I might create the audio, somebody else creates the visual, but together it has a greater value. The other issue that I can think of is that not only how do you attribute ownership to different parts, but how do you place a value on the different parts? Maybe the audio part is of more value than the visual part based on the nature of the work. So I can, if we're going to divide things up into micro intellectual property and trying to allocate value to each one of those, I can see some real implementation issues there.
Okay, which one do you want me to address first?
Well, the first one is, I guess, the dividing it up in a way that attributes the value to what it is somebody has contributed, and also after that, whether the sum of the parts is greater than each individual part.
Well, so the first part is how do you divide it up? Well, because intellectual property right now is exactly as you said. Currently in the business model, if you do work for somebody, it is inherently understood that the ownership transfers. However, there is a little bit of a sticky wicket there. If you know the Canadian Copyright Act, ownership always reverts to the creator, no matter what, unless otherwise stated in a license agreement or a contract. So just simply hiring me is not enough, although there is case law on both sides of this. But in Canada in particular, which has a very strong codified Copyright Act, you cannot sell your intellectual property. You can license it. Okay, so that's a mechanism that is applied. In terms of how you decide what gets what, or who gets what for what, there are very well tried and true, well-proven models of rating work. So we just take those and we say we're going to use the work rating as if you were in a contract, and we're going to compute what your financial value would have been had you been being paid in a film budget or in a studio music budget or what have you. I just watched this really cool documentary on Netflix, actually, it's called Hired Gun. And it's all about musicians who worked as players, studio players and on the road for famous acts, right? And they weren't given any of the IP, even though they may have participated in the creative process in the studio. They were paid as sidemen, and they surrendered their IP, and the star got the rights. So what we've designed is a system that allows for fractional ownership that can be assigned in a negotiation, or basically you decide at the beginning of the project, here's the budget, I agree to the budget, yes, and if the budget changes throughout the process, so be it. Now, if there's somehow an enhanced value of the collective work, that's all for the good, and that's shared pro rata by the people who agreed to work. And by the way, you made an important point, they are unpaid because they are looking to own their content. So, but there's lots of ways to deal with that. I mean, it's entirely possible to do feature film, for example, where people are paid subsistence salaries and still retain a portion of the rights. And there's a trade-off. So you can do a blend depending on which project and how much budget and so on and so forth. So, and this concept, by the way, isn't new. A lot of artists have gone into, here, I'll ask you a question. Do you know what Arnold Schwarzenegger's biggest personal grossing film was and why?
Terminator?
No, he was paid for that, and he surrendered his rights. No, he did a film called Twins with Danny DeVito, and they both decided to take a rev share as opposed to a fee. And they made more money with that film than they did with any of their other movies, both of them. So they liked the rev share model. So really what we're talking about is a rev share model that's based on effort in, rated at industry standards, and then contracted through a platform where all of the legal is part of the terms and conditions. So that's what we're up to. So what happens then is that the long tail value of the content monetarily as it's being transacted accrues to the individual owners pro rata. But the really cool part about this is that when they pass away, it is a chattel and can be willed to their heirs. And you cannot do that with a gig.
Pat, I want to see whether this model, this business model, is applicable in other fields. For example, you've talked about the creative industry. Do you also see this maybe in other forms of intellectual property creation? So, for example, if I worked at Apple and I had part of development of the iPhone, or if I worked and I had part of development of a detergent or cereal, any kind of product where you could maybe figure out what the value of the product is over the next number of decades and then attribute to all those individuals that worked.
Yeah, I mean, it's based on long tail revenues. So basically, if a design or a patent can, in our construct, be shared. It can be co-owned by the creators of the patent. And that can apply in any industry. It can apply in automotive design. It could apply, it all depends, right? It could certainly apply in medical patents done by teams of researchers working in kind, globally, and collaboratively. So, we think we solve a big problem in terms of the ability to collaborate freely without the constraints of a corporate relationship. Because again, and I'm not anti-corporation, don't think that for a second. I just think that the pendulum has swung too far and that individuals are not being taken into the value chain the way that they once were. And this all started with industrialization, which isn't that old a concept. I mean, what are we talking about? When the first textiles factories arose in industrialized Britain, it was probably in the 1750s, something like that, if my history mind is recalling correctly. So it's not that old. I mean, we're talking about less than 300 years. The previous 300 years, were subject to all kinds of different historical forces of, how humans organize themselves. But there were instances where collaborative, co-op types of ventures, and again, I use the guild reference because I think it's a good one, was a very healthy environment for people where value was retained where it was appropriate and it was delivered where it was appropriate, and there were opportunities for people to do okay. I work in an industry where we haven't seen rate increases for a generation. Okay, so people working in the film and television business right now who are generating content for these multinationals, they haven't had a raise in a generation.
Wow. Okay,
so let that sink in for a second. So, it's not good. And but we're not talking about a revolution here, and we don't want to stick it to anybody. But we are saying that we have an opportunity using the very technology that is being used by multinationals. We have the opportunity to use that exact same technology to create a slightly different value chain where value accrues and is retained by the creators of content or the creators of intellectual property. And as you've astutely observed, that can be applied to any form of intellectual property.
Very cool. Pat, as we come to the end of our podcast, do you have any takeaways for us?
Well, my audience is creators, so my attitude is you got into this so that you could do what you love and you could collaborate with other people if you chose, and that you could have fair access to market. So these are the problems that I think, a technological approach like ours solves. Because we are entering a time of our species' domination of the planet, and I don't want to get too wild and crazy here, but we're going to have to do something because right now, this whole idea of uncontrolled capitalism is taking us down a path where we're going to see more and more negative outcomes in terms of our ability to be sustainable as a species. So this might be one way to do that. I hope it has that kind of impact. So the takeaway is, it's a new idea, but it's an old idea, and it's really about fairness, and it's about again, egalitarianism. So we call it egalitarian micro-capitalism.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us today, Pat.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.